as I was studying the book of Acts and just thinking these things hitting me, as I was studying chapter 12, there were a couple things that struck me very strong, equally as powerfully, that I had not seen before. And no one yelled for that it was coming. It just kind of surprised me. Now, luckily, I get to walk away in a positive way. But that's all I want to do this morning. And I just want to share those two powerful things that struck me in the book of Acts. And the first one was the power of community. And the second one is the power of prayer. And so I want to start by talking about prayer first and then end with community. But as you look at Acts chapter 12, don't take my word for it. Boy, you look at it too and read through it and see if these things hit you like they did me. So I want to start in Acts chapter 12. I'm going to start right in verse 1 as we look at the power of prayer. It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. So this is going to take some imagining. So imagine with me that you are part of the church at this time. And it says that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church. So imagine you're not the group that got sent to prison. You're a part of the group that was thankfully left untouched. What are you doing regarding your friends, your brothers and sisters who are now sent to prison? What are you doing in the meantime? Well, you don't have to imagine long. All you have to do is read Acts 1 through 11 and you'll find out, because what happened in the early church, when problems occurred to church family members, the rest of the church rushed quickly to their help. Physically if they could, but always prayerfully. So I want you to imagine that your friends have been taken by the powers that be, and I want to imagine you on your knees praying for their help. Thankful that you weren't taken to prison, heartbroken that your friends were. Maybe even your family members. And you are praying for them. And then we learn in verse 2 that James, who was one of the 12 apostles, one of the leading 12 of this new church, was put to death. So as you are praying for God's mercy to be on the people in prison, including one of the key leaders of this church, your prayers end in grief. And you find out the terrible news about James. Verse 3. When he saw, meaning Herod, saw that this met with approval among the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. This happened during the festival of unleavened bread. After arresting him, he put him in prison, handing him over to be guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. Herod intended to bring him out for public trial after the Passover. Peter had already escaped from prison once before in Acts chapter 5. This guy was going to make sure it wasn't going to happen again. We'll put 16 guards on the guy. That should take care of it. Verse 5. So Peter was kept in prison, but the church was earnestly praying to God for him. The night before Herod was to bring him to trial, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and sentries stood guard at the entrance. Suddenly, an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up. "Quick, get up," he said. And the chains fell off Peter's wrists. And the rest of the verses in the first part of chapter 12 explain the details of this miraculous release, this miraculous answer to a church praying earnestly for him. Now, is anyone else struck by the fact that James wasn't rescued, but Peter was? With the church praying earnestly for both. Now, it doesn't say specifically they were praying for James, but based on their actions in every verse of every chapter before this, pretty sure they were. So why? Why was James left to die and Peter miraculously rescued? Well, here's the normal answer. Well, it was God's will for that to happen. That's what God decided. And that's probably very comfortable for some of you. But for some of you who are trying to wrestle with the actual personality of God and figure out how prayer fits into this whole scheme of things, there's a natural question I have been wrestling with for 10 years. And here's the question. Does prayer actually change things? Is it just an activity that we're supposed to engage in because it affects us? It makes me communicate with God and have to listen a little better. And so that's the benefit of prayer. Like the request I'm making or what I'm praying about is irrelevant. It's just the fact that I'm communicating to God and He's talking to me. And that's the whole point. Is that it? Or does prayer actually change circumstances? I think that's a decent question. And I'm not going to spend the 4 or 5 days necessary to unload that. And through all the scriptures, you have the same Bible I have. You study it like I have. If you don't have a Bible, there's Bibles in the pew. You take one home. It's now yours, okay? So you study your Bible. Look up where it talks about prayer and see what it says to you. I'm just going to show you one verse today as I wrestle with that question. Does prayer actually change anything? It's in James chapter 4, verse 2. It's the clearest and most profound answer to that question, in my opinion. James 4, 2. By the way, this is not the James who was just killed in prison. That was the brother of John. This James is the actual brother of Jesus. Now, he would die for his faith as well, but it would be later on and in a different way. So this is a different James, as long as we're clear on that. This James writes, to Christians, you do not have because you do not ask. Now, we can get into all the details of that, but at its foundation, that statement means, at the very least, prayer causes things to happen that would not happen without the prayer. You do not have whatever it's talking about, whatever James is talking about, there's something you don't have, there's something that's not occurring. Why? Because there's not praying for it. I'm going to get into a little more of the details here in a second, but I want you to sit with that and let that register that for some reason, the ruler of the universe, who needs zero help from anybody, has decided to allow our prayers to affect and change history, to change circumstances. You do not have because you do not ask. So the answer to the question, the note card answer is yes, prayer changes things. Prayer changes circumstances. Prayer affects history. If that's true, if James 4 verse 2 is true, if the ruler of the universe has allowed and decided that my prayers, that your prayers would change history, how foolish is it of me to avoid and neglect and not take seriously that privilege? That's one of the worst kind of foolishness there is. When Nelson comes up here to pray, how many of you love listening to that? How many of you wish you could pray like that? How many of you would like someone like Nelson to be in your house praying for you? One of the best things we get at our church office when someone's in trouble, sometimes they ask for the pastor, but almost always they ask for Nelson. And not just because he's more on time than I am, because you heard how he prays, you heard his heart. But I want you to know, and I don't mean this as a slight to Nelson in the least. I have the utmost respect and admiration for him. There's nothing special about that. All I see Nelson do, day to day, week to week, year to year, he takes this privilege seriously. He believes what the Bible says, that his prayers affect and can change history. That's it. That's the only key to praying like that. That's it? You don't have to have a degree. You don't have to have been in a Sunday school class for 90 years. No. You just have to believe James 4, verse 2. I met with a gal who joined our church in her late 80s, and we were talking about ways that she could serve in the church, and we were brainstorming, and she said, and she was kind of physically limited, and she said, all I can do is pray. And I said, that's not all you can do. Let me reframe what you just said. All you can do is change history. That's all you just said. If all you can do is pray, do you know the privilege God has given you and me with prayer? He said, you don't have because you don't ask. Now, does that mean you get whatever you ask for? No, it does not. If it did, I would have facial hair that I could grow, but I don't. I have prayed for that several times when I was younger. So, there's limits to this power. Now, here's where I'm at in my 10-year process. I've not landed on what my feeling and theology and belief with all of prayer is. That's way too big a thing to conquer in 10 years. But here's where I'm at today. I'm not sure I can change what God plans to do. So let me rephrase that and put the emphasis on the right word. I'm not sure I can change what God plans to do, but it seems like my prayers and your prayers can change how He plans to do it. I'm not sure that I can affect the what, but it seems like I can affect the how, the circumstances. I'm not sure how that all works together. Another question that goes along with this one, does prayer change God's mind? Or again, is it just a verbal exercise? I would say, well, at this point in my journey, someone asked me that, I would say it depends. I'm not sure it changes his mind on what he's going to do, but according to a lot of places I see, it changes his mind on how he plans to do that. And because he is infinitely powerful and infinitely wise, he can do all kinds of things by listening to the prayers of people like me and you and adjust how he's going to accomplish it and still get to the same end. But there's some things you and I could pray for that will never occur. If you decide right now as a church, which you won't, but if you decided to pray that Jesus would never return again, that prayer will never be answered. You can pray all you want. But there's way too many examples that I don't have time to look at in how circumstances were affected by simple prayers of regular people who loved God. So when does that church find out, okay, so God, you said no to this prayer, said yes to the Peter prayer, said no to the James prayer. What good could possibly come from that? It may be heaven until that insight's revealed. But I do know this, because of what Paul told me, what he said about himself. He said to live is Christ and to die is gain. Which means when you suffer because of your love for God, everybody stares at you in a way they will never look at you if your life is perfect and easy and just a bowl of cherries. So, there are ways that God gets glory, and your faith is made as a spotlight for that, and how relevant and necessary and beautiful the gospel is when things are bad. Maybe that was the case, but I don't know. James won't know until heaven. Maybe those folks didn't learn until they get to heaven. I don't know that I'm going to know till then. But God does get the last word. Always. And before we go any further, I want to give you a quote that Timothy Keller, who's a pastor in New York, said in a book a long time ago that I read regarding prayer, and it stuck with me ever since, and I want to show it to you on the screen. This has really helped me understand the role and the power and the privilege that I get through prayer. He says, God gives us what we would have prayed for if we knew what He knows. Because when you and I pray, we don't know everything. We don't know much. We certainly don't know the next moment. How many of you have prayed for things that have never come true? And boy, are you glad now. I do know, though, when I don't get answered prayer, maybe it's because God's actually giving me a not yet or a no that I actually would have prayed for if I knew the whole scope of everything that he knows. Maybe that's it. That's way too short of time to talk about prayer. But we've got to move on to the second one. The second powerful thing that hit me in Acts chapter 12 isn't just the power of prayer, but the power of community. So I want to back up to chapter 12, verse 5. I went over it soon. I'll try and slow down on it this time. It says, Peter was kept in prison, but the church was earnestly praying to God for him. The church at this point is about 5,000 to 10,000 people, very conservatively. So was this a church scheduled meeting? On Thursday night at 7 o'clock, we're all 9,000 of us getting together at the town square. We're going to surround the prison. We're going to walk around it 7 times. That seemed to work once before, and pray. Is that what happened? Down through the details of Peter's miraculous release, when we get to verse 12, it says, when this had dawned on Peter, in other words, when he realized that he had miraculously been spared prison again, it says he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. So we learned the answer. No, it wasn't a called church prayer meeting. Because the way it worked back then is you had groups and pockets of church folks meeting in homes. And apparently, those communities of people were together, praying for days. This was during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Peter wasn't released until the last day. So for days, thousands of Christians met in little pockets of fellowship and prayed earnestly and went to bed with no answer. And got up the next day and did their life and prayed again. No answer. And they did that for days until finally the last day it occurred. What occurred? Anonymous people. Thousands of people whose names are not listed in Scripture or any history book for any achievement whatsoever were in homes, meeting together, holding hands, hand on the shoulder, were in a circle, were somehow together praying for Peter's release. And they were praying with urgency and expectancy. And the power of those explosive communities did a lot of things. It changed lives over and over. The church was being added daily. It miraculously released Peter from prison. So as I read that, my closing thought is, I don't want to take lightly the privilege I have. And I don't want it to take a tragedy to bring people of faith together to pray to change history, to change circumstances. When tragedies strike, Christians are quick to rally together. They did that here. I don't want it to take that. If I believe that the prayer of me and you actually can affect the world, what on earth am I waiting for? It's not limitless. There are conditions on this. Things like faith, things like confession, things like taking seriously the sin in your life. There's all of that. But what if pockets of people in this church got together regularly and prayed? Isn't that one of the most important things we could do from the world standpoint? From our town standpoint? What if we did that? Who knows what would happen? I do know this. I don't have because I don't ask. There are some things that will not occur without prayer. It's not my decision. It's not my design. It's just the fact.